Good afternoon. It's good to see you all. Thank you for being here. It's a good day for the Alice Gorlin Memorial Lecture. First, we want to thank the Gorlin Lecture Committee for organizing this event. Please be informed that there will be food served afterwards in the Stinson Center. Good student food, pizza, salad, etc. Make sure that you are aware of that. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 25th Alice Connor Gorlin Memorial Lecture. Alice Gorlin earned her PhD in economics from the University of Michigan, and she was a professor of economics here at Oakland University throughout the 70s and 80s. She was also the first female faculty member in the School of Business Administration. Alice Gorlin made her mark as a scholar in the area of Soviet studies. She was also a gifted teacher and a generous faculty mentor. Because she cared passionately about international issues, the Gorlin Lecture Series, named in her honor, has accepted as its mission to promote understanding of international issues and events. I would now like to introduce our 2019 Gorlin Lecturer. She is Dr. Nancy Birdsall. Dr. Birdsall earned a PhD in economics from Yale University and a Master of Arts in International Relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Birdsall is President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development, a policy-oriented research institution that she founded in 2001 in Washington, D.C. Prior to launching the center, she was Director of the Economic Reform Project at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focused on issues of globalization and inequality, as well as on the reform of the international financial institutions. From 1993 to 1998, Dr. Birdsall was Executive Vice President of the Inter-American Development Bank. Before joining the IDB, she spent 14 years at the World Bank, most recently as Director of the Policy Research Department. Dr. Birdsall is the author, co-author, or editor of more than a dozen books and monographs. She has also written more than 75 articles for books and scholarly journals, with shorter pieces appearing in dozens of other outlets. Her most recent work focuses on the relationship between income distribution and economic growth and the role of global public goods in development. Dr. Birdsall is a member of the Board of Directors of the International Food Policy Council, of the African Population and Health Research Center, and of Mathematica. She has chaired the board of the International Center for Research on Women and has served on the boards of the Social Science Research Council, Overseas Development Council, and Axiom. Dr. Birdsall will address us today on the topic Globalization and Global Development, the good, the bad, the ugly. What now? It is our very great honor and privilege to have her here at Oakland University. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to the 2019 Alice Connor Gorlin Memorial Lecturer, Dr. Nancy Birdsall.
Well, thank you very much, Addington, for making me feel much sought after and very welcome. Thank you also it's nice to have the dean. I know the chair of the economics faculty is here, and to see all the students and other faculty. It's really an honor, to do the Alice Gorlin lecture. She was clearly a pioneer. And I love in this brochure what it says, her dedication to the role of human beings as citizens of the world. So I hope you'll remember that as I get to the end of this lecture, if you're still listening. So Addington, you want me to take about 40 or 50 minutes, leaving some time for questions. So why don't you tell me at 30 minutes so that I speed up? That's what usually happens. Okay. Oh, I wasn't supposed to show you this. Wait, don't look at it. So, many of you are too young to answer this question, but No, I'm giving away the answer a little bit. But for those of you who are, say, in your 30s or 40s or older, try to think of when you first heard the word globalization. If anyone wants to shout out a year, any of the older folks.
1972.
72, 95, and 85. So this is the person who said 72 was very prescient. This is just one of those Google type N graphs, word graphs. And I was amazed to see that the use of that word only really got started in the early to mid 80s and absolutely took off, has taken off in the 90s and since. So that's just a surprise. Let me start with the good of globalization. And I do want to emphasize that I'm a development economist, and you're going to hear a lot about development, not so much about international finance and some of the more traditional subjects in international economics. But I think given that about 2/3 to 3/4 of the people in the world live in developing countries now and in emerging markets, it makes sense for more of us to think of development and its implications broadly speaking, and to think as economists as much as we can about those implications, because the big difference between rich world, which is the label I'll use for the advanced economies most of the time, and developing countries is rich world is rich, and developing countries, at least relatively speaking, are still poor but growing fast. So there's a lot of controversy about globalization. A lot of the discussion associates globalization with things like the Washington Consensus, some of you might know about, and with the neoliberal approach to economics. We can talk about that in the question period. I'm going to try and use globalization in the traditional sense. It's used primarily as an economic phenomenon, the integration of markets. It can also include the spread of ideas and of technology, but the integration of markets, trade flows, capital flows, and flows of people, as well as ideas, as I said. So we start with the good, what's good about globalization in the last 20, 30 years, since the big openings started in the late 80s and the 90s of many more, the liberalization of many economies. So the good, here's a quick list, and I'm going to go through them so you don't have to learn them right now, starting with the well-known amazing reduction in poverty, particularly accelerating in the 1990s. But I wanted to show this because in 1820, there were only about 1 million people, I just looked it up, in the world. And now, of course, we're more like 7 billion, over 7 billion. So in that period, the proportion of people living under more or less $2 a day, $1.90, $2 a day, has gone from 90% more or less to now we're down around 10%. In a time when it's not showing in the graph the number of people or the growth rate of people or population was really high. So it's an extraordinary achievement associated with what Adam Smith called the extent of the market. As there's been more integration of national country markets across the world in a global system, it's really been an astounding success to the extent we can associate greater integration around the world with prosperity. And I don't think there's much question we can. One of the reasons the U.S. was so prosperous so early is that it was such a big economy, and we did not have, Connecticut with different rules than Michigan, than Arizona and California, and so on. So this gives you a better picture just for the, this is just low, okay, this is developing countries, the red line, and what you see is a big decline, particularly since 1990. So here you see how globalization mattered for reduction of poverty, or the times of globalization since 1990. China is there also because it's had one of the most impressive reductions in extreme poverty. And India is there a little bit slower and really only starting in the last 10 years. I do want to say that there are other countries that you might not think of, including in, say, well, in Asia like Vietnam, but across Africa as well, Kenya, Ghana, countries we still think of as quite poor. Latin America has have had declines in poverty, not quite as dramatic. So this is a chart of what economists call unconditional convergence. The unconditional refers to the idea, okay, convergence, as many of you may know if you're studying economics, refers to the phenomenon of, for very recently, developing countries growing faster than rich countries. So starting in about 1900, or even earlier with the Industrial Revolution, what happened is today's rich countries started growing very fast with industrialization. And the rest of the world didn't grow much. So there was what some people have called the big divergence. Just in the last 10, 15 years, we start to see a change, which shows up in this, actually it's in the 90s, which shows up in this chart. This is a very complicated chart. Don't try to figure it out necessarily. But what it's showing you is starting around 1990, the coefficient on regressions that relate growth of countries to their initial income becomes negative. And what that means, so that's why they're sinking. See those blue and black dots. So what that says is the relationship between how rich a country is or was and how fast it was growing was negative. So for the first time, the richer countries, the US, the Europeans, Australia, Japan, etc., started growing more slowly than many of the emerging market economies. So that's a very big deal after close to 100 years. And now, for a long time, it was true that if you conditioned growth of poor countries on simple factors like lower education, lower human capital, poorer infrastructure, then they were doing fine. But that didn't really matter because development is about increasing human capital and having bridges and ports and so on. So unconditional convergence is a very big deal. So another good thing has been falling inequality. This is quite well known among people who follow development. In 1975, you have to look at these graphs. What they're doing is they're showing you the distribution of people in the world independent of what country they live in. So sort of John Lennon, imagine there is no country, okay? And in 1975, it's a two-humped graph. Most poor people are on the left, and red is Asia, so most of them were in Asia. And most poor countries and poor people were on the left, and then we have this second hump on the right. What happened by 2015 is that if you line up all the people in the world, doesn't matter where they live, you integrate all the different household surveys that have all the different, that have data on the income of different people around the world, we lose the hump. And what's really interesting in this is, it's hard to see, but that line, that pointer, that one, that's the poverty line of 190. So what that's telling you is the poverty line of, let's see, the modal income, or that big red hump of the mode, more or less, of the distribution, was lower than $1.90 a day in 1975. And you can sort of guesstimate the median maybe around $5. No, I guess lower, more like $2 in 1975, compared to median income in 2015, which looks more like $5 to $7. So this is a big change, the disappearance of the hump. I can't remember. The next good thing around inequality is shared growth. How many people have seen this famous elephant graph? Yeah, okay, your chair. Very good. So this elephant graph has, let me see how I can explain it. Again, it's the distribution of people in the world by income, independent of where they live. There's no country, not country specific. So you have on the left the poorest people. There's 20 ventiles. They're distributed evenly by where they fall in the global distribution of income. So the poorest people are on the left and the richest people are on the right. And I've put, instead of putting the percentiles, you know, the 5%, 10%, 50, I've put absolute daily income per person. So the poorest people in that first 5% of the world population are at about 90 cents a day. And then the richest people up here, it's only about 180 a day. The thing is that these household surveys, people at the top understate their income. They don't yet reflect tax data that some well-known economists have used in recent years, like Piketty, you've probably heard of, to show that the rich people have much higher. Okay, so what it's showing is which groups captured what proportion or what amount of growth over the period 1988 to 2011. So what it shows you is who are these people who had got the most out of growth in this period. They really got ahead. I call them strugglers. They're not the official international line poor. They're people between $2 and $10 a day per capita. That is not a lot of money, but they're not extremely poor. They're stressed out people. They're strugglers and strivers. And they've done tremendously well. And a lot of them, of course, are in China. So they're people between $2 a day and $10 a day. These people about here are the US, middle class. These people are the the rich country rich. And these people in red are the developing world middle class. The point is, it's been great news for the great majority of people in the world who are between $2 and $10. That's what it's like. So if and when you travel to developing countries and you see the big urban slums, those are the strugglers. They've escaped the worst poverty, and that's where they are. The other thing is they're the winners for the period 88 to 2011. And as we keep reading about these richer people that are unhappy, including in the Midwest and rural areas of America, were the losers in a relative sense. Okay, so this gives you the same picture. The percent of population earning more in different groups. So low income, on average, is the worst. Low income countries, that includes all the really fragile states in Africa and so on. But lower middle income, China's had this huge progress. And this is just a picture to give you a better feel for these middle class people. This is $10 to $50. I have another whole talk about the middle class and the strugglers. And you see the difference between Ethiopia at the bottom and Chile at the top. Brazil is getting up toward 50%. And that seems important to me. It's very hard to prove because, as Aristotle said, it's really good to have a middle class as a kind of ballast for a working society. And the way to think about it for developing countries in modern times now is you need enough people who can afford to pay tax. It's really hard to pay tax if you're at $2 to $10. People do because of the value-added tax and consumption taxes, but not much. So you need people who can afford to pay taxes who are getting to be a little bit above $10 a day. For a family of 3, $10 a day is $10,000 a year or something like that. So, that's the beginning of being more secure middle class in the developing world. So people have to pay taxes in order to have a government that works, can do things, and they have to have enough education and enough time to be political participants, to hold their governments accountable. So that's the idea. Now, having a middle class at 50 or 60% is certainly not a magic bullet. I'm scared to go back. It's certainly not a magic bullet. And, Turkey, Brazil, these societies that are now getting to 50 to 60%, they still have their problems on governance. But they do have governments, more or less, that have institutions and work, and, maybe it's not all good in the thinking of democracy and so on. But not bad. And you see this here, that when people have more education, because there's more growth, then there's more schooling, they're more engaged civically around the world. This is participated in a peaceful protest on the right. Okay. And another good thing about globalization is the spread of ideas and norms. This nice graph, what you see here is that in the developing world with the rise of education, this only goes to 2011, there's growing awareness of climate change. I thought that was really interesting. This is from World Value Surveys. I think probably the 50% in the developed countries has risen substantially in the last few years. And no question the 64% has risen as well. So we're all becoming more aware of that idea. This one is very interesting because it shows you amazing declines in fertility, controlling for income in different periods. So the green line at the top is in 1960, where higher income was associated across countries with higher fertility. This is just low and middle income countries, low and lower middle income countries. So it leaves out emerging markets, for example, in Latin America. But it includes Central America, Africa, poorest countries in Asia. And then if you look at the lower line in 2016, again, controlling for income. And this is purchasing power parity, real constant dollars, etc. Look at the change. You can probably explain some of it by education, but education is in part the outcome of higher income. But some of it has to be explained by just the idea that it's okay to control, for women and men to control their fertility and to choose smaller families. Or, you don't even need to put a value on it. It's just an idea that has spread incredibly around the world, to the point where countries like Bangladesh now have total fertility rate, which is close to average number of children per woman, of 2. And even in Africa, fertility rates have fallen from an average of 6 20 years ago to 3, and seem to be continuing finally to fall. So this we won't talk about that. I'd rather go on. This shows you the point for Africa, among others. Another norm that's changing is whether it's okay, and this is based on responses by women, are there justifications for being beaten, for beating wives? So women in demographic and health surveys, which take place primarily now in relatively low-income countries, are given a list of reasons that might justify wife beating. And there's been a dramatic decline, not dramatic, but some decline, again, independent of income, and that's just in a fairly short period of time, over 10 years, that it's not a good idea. There's hardly any justification or no justification for beating your wife. So that's the good. Now let's go to the second part, the bad. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what some people call financialization of globalization and several other points, premature deindustrialization, etc. So the first thing to point out that there's very sophisticated economic work suggesting, kind of surprisingly, that it's developing countries that have not relied on foreign capital that have grown the fastest, which is kind of surprising. But the theory is that often it's not foreign direct investment, it's more portfolio flows, sovereign debt issues, and so on. And that too much inflow of capital that doesn't go into highly productive investment affects your exchange rate. It makes your exchange rate appreciate. That means you're less competitive in exports. So this is, a problem for oil economies in a different way. They're getting all this flow of income from selling oil or other minerals. And some of you may have studied, the tulip boom in what century? In the 17th century. That's why it's called Dutch disease. So it's possible to manage these inflows, but it's a challenge if you're in a relatively weak economy. Maybe the central bank is not so independent. It's under pressure from finance ministry and so on. As we see a little bit of that. That happens in every country. We're having a little bit of that now in the U.S. If you're reading the paper about pressures from the Trump administration and from President Trump on Jay Powell, the head of the Fed. So anyway, this is just, fancy econometric work that suggests that countries like China, Korea, I can't remember what MYS is up there. I'm scared to use this pointer. Yeah, there we go. But these countries have done very well, even though they continually ran surpluses on their current account. So economists call that money going uphill. What you normally think of is that the poorer countries need capital to invest, and so capital flows downhill. But there are countries that have had their capital flowing uphill. So in the case of China, China has huge investments in treasuries, in dollars. So interesting, and the point is financialization of globalization is not itself necessarily a great thing. And the further problem is that, in fact, it can be bad news. And it's usually bad news because the bad news is usually associated with what we call footloose capital. Labor is mostly non-tradable. If you're an American worker, you stay in America. Capital is footloose. It can go anywhere, and it can move around very, very quickly. So many of you may be vaguely aware of speculation in capital markets, on currencies, and so on. And this tends to be costly for developing countries, having hot money going in and out. And what this picture shows, to keep thinking about this, is here you have 78, what was going on then? 1980. Emerging, oh, that's the lost decade in Latin America, sort of. It's a chart of crises of different kinds, right? Banking, default, banking crisis, currency crisis. So there you see the 1980s, and then you see over here the 1998 Asian financial crisis. Argentina had a crisis. Then things calmed down a little, and it's too bad we don't quite get the bump yet from the global financial crisis that comes here. It would show up more here. You see here the federal funds rate, which is what the Federal Reserve in the U.S. is deciding all the time, whether to go up, down, in between. In fact, a lot of this calmness is during when the federal funds rate was low because of QE1 and QE2, some of you will know about. Okay. So all's calm, then countries in the developing world aren't so subject to the ups and downs, which happen for good reasons when the Fed decides based on the economy here. But sometimes that has an unfortunate, unintended consequence of pulling money out of emerging markets or pushing money suddenly into emerging markets, which goes back to the challenge of managing inflows and outflows. And this is a sort of picture of sudden stops in Latin America. It's from an old paper, but it shows the coincidence. As soon as, for one reason or another, countries suffer some downturn in commodity prices or whatever, financial markets abandon them. Particularly, these were the days of fixed exchange rates in many cases, for those of you studying international economics. So they would end up with a currency crisis as the markets challenge the country's currency. And finally, they had to devalue. Okay, another interesting thing for development economists particularly is something called premature deindustrialization, which is associated with globalization in the following way, that the good part of globalization is when countries become able to trade and export. What this picture is showing, this is from very well-known work of Danny Roderick, is what he calls premature deindustrialization. What it says is that there are two reasons why industrialization is the phenomenon of its being premature deindustrializing in developing countries, or two things associated. First, industrialization is peaking at lower levels of manufacturing employment. And second, it's peaking at lower levels of income. So the chart's a little confusing because it has coefficients on the left, but I'll tell you some of what it says. If you can find Great Britain, where's Great Britain? I've got it. Oh yeah, Great Britain, 1961. So the share of manufacturing in the share of employment in manufacturing in Great Britain peaked in 1971 at a little over 30%. Okay? The share of manufacturing in Korea in 1989 peaked at a little under 30%. The share of manufacturing in India peaked in 2002. Oh, these aren't percents. Sorry, I have the percents. Great Britain, it peaked at 30%. Korea at 40%. India at about 12%, and now falling already. So the magic that occurred in East Asia and subsequently in China of having all this industrial growth generating so many jobs is not happening anymore. Can you imagine that India, a relatively poor country, is already having fewer people working in manufacturing? I mean, some of it is because manufacturing is becoming more productive, as in the US, so you don't need as many workers because of automation, and to some extent because of globalization being associated with the spread of automation of new technologies and so on. So it's a caveat around how things happen. And finally, I wanted to show you, because I said that across people in the world, inequality is falling. Just a little bit, frankly, but it's still falling. When I showed you the elephant chart, that was one of the points. However, it's if you think in absolute terms, and I hope this works. Yeah, so I love this. This is from Gapminder or something. So the rich world is over there on the right at 40,000, and the poor world. So this is global inequality from 1960 to 2017. And you see rich people getting farther and farther away. The big orange one is Asia or China or something. Now, how could this be if inequality is declining? What are we talking about? The difference is between growth rates, in effect, and absolute change. So I remember at one point I was in Mexico, and I was in the city, and in a nice part of the city, and there were Nike sneakers in the window. I should stop this, right? So it doesn't distract you. Don't look at that yet. So I'm in the city, and I see these Nike sneakers, and they were $50 or $60. And I had gotten kind of obsessed about this issue of absolute inequality. So imagine, your income is $1,000 a year. You're a single young man, your income's $1,000 a year. The economy is growing at 5% a year, and you capture 5% of the growth. Now you have $1,050 the following year. Your neighbor, or the neighbors you can see, are at $100,000 a year, and they capture less than 5%. But still, the change in their income is something short of 100 and a million. I wrote it down. I can't do that. Of 105,000. Maybe it's 103,000. So they're 3,000 richer because they shared less in the growth. Thinking back to that elephant chart, right? But they're $3,000 richer, and you're $50 richer, which is probably not enough to buy a pair of Nike sneakers if you're a young man in Mexico City. So absolute inequality may be what people think about and live with when they see changes around them. And maybe we come back to that. This is just a picture to show you that some norms are sticky. This shows mean age of women at first birth in the poorest countries, many of the poorest countries in the world. And my view, I'm doing a whole research program study on age at first birth as a great proxy for women's agency and women's empowerment. Because fundamentally, only when women can delay or time births, particularly the first one, can they be like men in terms of their ability to plan a future. And we take it for granted, I think, in countries like the US, except when the abortion issue comes up, maybe. But in most of the developing world, even where fertility rates have fallen to low numbers, there's pressure often on women to get married and show they can have children. So you have age at first birth in South Asia or in countries like India at 17, 18 years old, still on average. And of course, another caveat is the distributional effect. In the US, what this shows you is the relationship between local labor effects of import competition across census tracts in the U.S. More, I'm going to say more below on the backlash, but this is something behind all of what we've been reading about certain parts of the U.S. feeling much more the impact of, either Chinese imports or immigration, allegedly. It's hard to know exactly what. So this is the same thing. I showed earlier something about the wage in the U.S., and here we see it's going up for the top 5%, and it's not really moving for the middle quintile. So you're probably also reading that over and over again. Median wages in the U.S. are stagnant now since, this doesn't look right to me. I can't remember. It's from the Census Bureau, but they've been stagnant since about 1980. Before that, I think in the 70s they were growing. I think one of the things that I want to bring out here is that, but is this globalization, or is it a whole lot of other things, including automation, poor social policy, the unions disappearing, lack of any support, political support, or government rules that encourage collective bargaining, et cetera, et cetera. The fight over minimum wages that haven't risen in line with real income in the last many years. So now to the ugly, and I'm just going to go through this list relatively quickly. So the first thing is legal barriers to economic migration. I just want to tell a couple of stories. I come from an Irish Catholic family, despite the name Birdsall. And in the 1840s, during the potato famine, 1 million people came from Ireland to the U.S. And they constituted, it was 5% or something of the Irish population, maybe more. Now, today, in the world, we have a situation, I'm not going to talk about the U.S. yet, but there are refugees that cannot, in Lebanon and Jordan, Lebanon, 25,000 Syrians, 25,000 a year of Syrians. 1/4 now of the population of Lebanon are in Lebanon from Syria. This is a relatively poor country, Lebanon, with some political problems. It's extraordinary. And now finally the Lebanese have so much pressure, they can't deal with it. They're sort of trying to push them back into Syria, including into conflict areas. So, and then I'm going to tell you about trillions on the sidewalk by showing you this complicated graph, but it's just to show that this is careful research behind the incredibly high cost in global welfare associated with legal barriers to migration. So this first thing, our hat C, is in effect a ratio of migrants' wages in the U.S. to wages in home country of equivalent people, same education, same age, etc. So I'm showing you the highest ratios, the countries with the highest ratios and the lowest. What this is saying is that the same doctor in Nigeria with this trained in Nigeria, right? It's actually lower educated people on average, but just to give you the feel for it. When she lands in the U.S., her income goes up 1,600% on average. Same skills, et cetera, et cetera. from Argentina, it's lower. It's more than 2 times as much. So this is a paper by a colleague of mine at the Center for Global Development and others. He does it with others. And I mean, basically it's saying the world is sort of missing out on use of all kinds of skills because people can't move. To go back to the U.S., how many people who are now students at Oakland University will stay in Rochester Hills or wherever we are and not go to Ann Arbor or New York or California? Right? And how many faculty here came from somewhere else? So this ability of people to move so that you get equilibrium, in effect, in wages is it generates all kinds of additional growth and product and value added and happiness and many other things. So the barriers in this century to people moving around are amazingly costly. The gains, that ratio is a ratio, so the dollar gain associated with it is a little bit different, but I've put all those numbers down. It's very carefully done paper if anybody wants to ask me about it later. Basically, the conclusion is that the world is leaving trillions of dollars on the sidewalk. If you add up, all these possible gains and say 5% more people could move, it starts to be very large numbers of people. So another not so nice thing is labor repression in global supply chains. Some of you might remember or have read about a few years ago the factory collapse in Bangladesh, where many of the women working in apparel died. The building absolutely collapsed. There's no regulation, there's no protection, and so on. And what happened is that initially most of these factories are contracting with global firms, your clothes that you wear. And there was a big outcry, quite effective NGO move, that something had to be done and that these firms based in the rich world couldn't sort of slough off that it was subcontracts and they didn't have any responsibility. And some of the firms started to pull out of Bangladesh, but then they didn't. So when they started to pull out, the government of Bangladesh announced some pro-labor reforms, because what's happening is Bangladesh is competing with Cambodia and Pakistan, and now it's going to be Laos and still with Vietnam, trying to have as cheap labor as possible to attract the factory work and to have a leg up on exports of apparel. So it's a market imperfection writ large. It's a little bit like, the various parts of the U.S. that we're trying to attract Amazon, and they're subsidizing on the positive side the company. So that aspect of globalization is particularly unpleasant. Same thing happened with the collapse of the Trans-Pacific Agreement, the trade agreement with East Asia, Latin America, the U.S., Canada, and others, which included reforms. It said if developing countries wanted to join in this trade treaty agreement and get better access to rich country markets, they had to be better about allowing collective bargaining, giving collective bargaining rights to labor in their country. So in Vietnam, when they anticipated joining the TPP, which would have been very good for them in many ways, they started to develop, a movement or from the government side that would have allowed collective bargaining. But then when the U.S. pulled out of the TPP and the whole thing collapsed, they reversed. They didn't go ahead. So some things like, it goes back to capital is mobile and labor is stuck in a general sense. And as we know, generally capital is held by the wealthy, not necessarily only or entirely, but on average, those with capital tend to have more resources than those with only their labor to sell. It sounds Marxist, but I guess it is. It goes back to, and we have to get over it. It's been over 150 years since Marx. So now we economists have to be okay with thinking about income distribution and capital and labor and that sort of thing. So who's to blame for this? I don't know. Multinational corporations, the profit motive, Homo economicus. I don't know. Here's a picture. The trend doesn't matter. This is the 5 countries with the highest secrecy score on use of banking and capital and so on. And this is done by a group called the Tax Justice Center, based in the UK. And it's very hard to get this kind of data, but basically they're saying these countries do a lot of things that, create financial secrecy. They allow for tax havens. I wrote down some of this. They don't have a public register of trusts and foundations. They don't record actual ownership of companies. So, there are a lot of companies that have ownership of other companies and other people that are hidden from tax authorities. That's called beneficiary ownership. So they don't require exposing who's owning what. So because the U.S. is such a big economy, although it doesn't have the lowest score, it has a lower score than Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. It has a big effect because it has the most inflows of capital. So I'll come back to this on being global citizens, We're wondering what the U.S. is doing. Here's tax haven data. U.S. profits made in offshore tax havens increase. You've all read about Apple in Ireland and so on. This, by the way, is a graph put together by Gabriel Zuckman, who was the co-author with Thomas Piketty in finally getting access to tax data in order to really look at true changes in income inequality in the world. And so I want to end with the global power in politics and go through this quickly. First, country competition, lower capital, I've talked about that. Some people call it corporate profiteering. That's actually the example among U.S. states of trying to capture Amazon jobs by subsidizing, which enhances the profits of the corporation, but takes money from the taxpayers in effect. Ferocious resistance to the Tobin tax, the financial transactions tax, which Wall Street has resisted. You may want to ask about it if you don't know what it is. And in the U.S., when the U.S. dominated the global market, it behaved reasonably well. It was the most competitive anyway, and as the market grew, the extent of the market, to use Adam Smith's expression, grew. That was good for the U.S. The U.S. had more places to send its stuff and so on. I think there's a sort of fundamental historical underlying deep issue now that the U.S. doesn't feel as a country so on top of things with the rise of China, which is a little bit perverse because in the medium term, just as we supported after World War II, very big flows in the Marshall Plan so that Europe could revive, and that benefited, prosperity there benefited us. In the medium term, prosperity in the rest of the world, which is getting bigger as a proportion of people and as a proportion of the global GDP, should be good for prosperity in America. But that's not where we are. The U.S. is not, as I'll show you, such a good actor anymore. So summarizing, I think of this issue of we have a global economy without the equivalent of a global polity. I mean, we don't want a global government. You can't manage democratic arrangements if we were voting at the world level for the head of the world. But we need more effective and reformed global institutions, Financial Stability Board, International Monetary Fund, the multilateral banks, on and on, the G7, the G20, that you all read about or will read about when you have more time to read the papers or the equivalent of the papers. Okay, so what now? I have 5 minutes if we want to have questions.
Yes.
Okay, so this is the last section. First, the difficult politics of rising expectations in the developing world. It's the other side of what I showed you before. These people from $2 to $10 have benefited tremendously from growth. But now growth has slowed in the developing world, partly because China has slowed, and so they're not buying as much and so on. So I think we're already starting to see some of the problems that can arise from that these people that they had hopes for their children, and now they might be dashed. This is a picture of why that's a problem, because even in a rich country, relatively speaking, like Brazil, the middle class is in yellow, $10 to $50. Median income is still below, or this was 5 years ago, still below the middle class. So the middle class associates with the rich. You know, when you have median income, a little bit more like the US, the middle class wants a level playing field, it wants a fair game, and so on. It's not trying to capture through lobbying or whatever rich. So this difficult politics. And we saw already in 2016 the backlash, Brexit, US isolationism, Italy sinking, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a difficult time for globalization. Here we see an interesting thing about the backlash, although we hear it's there in Europe. What's interesting about this picture for me is we can't be sure that we should be blaming globalization in the US, because rather than our failure to have appropriate social and other domestic policies, because the Europeans are managing the issue better. And we're even seeing a little bit of reversal in politics in some countries in Europe, the pushback against the backlash. So that's a cautionary tale, even if you're studying global economics and international affairs. You have to keep paying attention across all these issues to policies in the US. And so we want to end up being global citizens, getting back to the Sustainable Development Goals, if any of you have heard of those, and the Paris Accord on climate, more climate, collective action at the global level. That would be strengthening the global polity, which is some sort of political equivalent in some form of the global economy. And this is a picture that shows you across the world, more educated people more strongly identify as world citizens, going back to Alice Gorlin many years ago. So with the increase in education around the world, I am hopeful that more people will start to have global consciousness and recognize they're in a big global market and think more like global citizens and push for better policies and programs across the board. We see the same thing here, the rise of NGOs that have registered at the international level with the UN. And finally, I want to end, it's a bad title. This is a chart. The only thing that's important is you notice that the United States is at the bottom. This is a product that we do annually at the Center for Global Development, and it ranks the richest countries in the world on what we call their commitment to development, measured in the adequacy or goodness, more of a set of policies: aid, finance, technology, environment, trade, security, and migration. Each component you can look up on the website, Center for Global Development. If you Google it, you'll get there. Has various measures in it, all very objective, data-driven. You see it doesn't change very much from year to year. I mean, from country to country here, you'd have to look closely. But when we first started doing it in 2003, the US was in the middle of the pack. It's now fallen to the bottom. So the US needs more global citizens, right? Let me end saying needs more young Americans to be active global citizens, aware of our acute interdependence in a changing global system. Thank you very much.
In one of the first graphs you showed, it seemed that 1990 was a turning point for the percentage of the population living in the poverty line. What would you attribute that turning point to, being from? The technology boom or the rise of democracy?
Mostly it's liberalization in China and in India. In China, it's around after Tiananmen Square, which was 1989. Although they'd started, before that, they made it much easier for people to, for example, not reach quotas in how much staples they had to farm. They allowed village enterprises, which were sort of capitalists, entrepreneurial. They allowed competition across local areas. And so they started to grow as they allowed their internal market to become more of a market. And in India, in the late 80s, a new government said, we will have a business-friendly approach. We will try to reduce the heavy hand of regulation. So this was, sort of doing the Thatcher-Reagan thing from a much harsher base of state-led activity. So, to some extent, I think maybe it was overdone with problems to which UK and US have since adjusted, more or less badly or goodly. In developing countries in 1990, many were still the government really ran a lot. You had state-run enterprises, they borrowed from state-run banks, so you had a lot of bad, borrowing, low production, hemorrhaging and fiscal costs, macroeconomic problems. By the 2000s, because of reforms that are sometimes labeled the Washington Consensus, you have really pretty good macroeconomic management in Africa, and African countries start to grow at 5% a year. So it's basically liberalization writ large.
One more question? Along that line, does 1990 correlate also with China's entry into our markets primarily?
Yes, absolutely.
It almost looks like that overlays with your poverty line.
Yes.
Kind of directly correlates with 1990 also.
Right. As they liberalized, they wanted to export. In effect, they started to imitate, it sort of delayed policy contagion in a good sense to the tremendous success of Taiwan and Korea, which came in the 60s and 70s, based on exporting low skill, being competitive in pajamas, basically. And then just gradually climbing the ladder as newer technologies were implemented and so on. That's why this premature deindustrialization is a little bit troubling, because in manufacturing, we understand how in the past countries have climbed the ladder of more technological sophistication. And we don't have the same grip on how you can do that in services, and especially in informal services that are not, which is where all those strugglers work in developing countries. You know, they're not pay stub workers. They don't have regular income. They're selling in the streets, and they're little micro enterprises making furniture and so on. So productivity gains are limited.
Okay, Amelia, you get to ask the last question.
So, as it seems to good, bad, and ugly, how would you view globalization as a whole? I know there are different parts to it, good, bad, and ugly, but what do you see being the most striking?
Oh, I thought you wanted my bottom line.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's have hands. What's your bottom line? Overall good? Overall bad? I'm with you. It's about managing it better, not about slowing it down.
One final task I need to take care of, and that's to present Dr. Birdsall with the Alice Connor Gorlin Memorial Award for excellence in the field of international economics.
Thank you very much.